In the summer of 1941, when the fields of Europe were golden and the air was thick with heat, the German army surged eastward with unstoppable confidence. Operation Barbarossa had begun, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crossed into the Soviet Union. They advanced like a storm of steel, certain that the war would be won before the first snow fell. German generals, standing before maps stretched across oak tables, spoke of victory as if it were inevitable. Moscow would fall by October, they said. The Red Army would crumble like France had, and the Russian winter, that ancient specter whispered about in history books, was dismissed as superstition. "We are not Napoleon," one officer reportedly boasted. "We will finish before the snow." But they were wrong. As summer turned to autumn, the vast plains of the Soviet Union swallowed their momentum. The roads became rivers of mud, the dreaded Rasputitsa. German tanks, so efficient on paved roads, sank into the muck. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. The Wehrmacht's precision machinery, its trucks, engines, and weapons, began to choke on the elements. Still, they pushed forward. Villages burned, cities fell, and the Soviet armies retreated deeper into their homeland. By November, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Soldiers laughed at the sight of them, believing the end was near. They had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Victory was within reach, but the temperature began to drop, first to freezing, then far below. At minus 20 degrees Celsius, oil thickened into sludge. At minus 30 degrees Celsius, fuel froze in tanks. Engines that had powered the German advance suddenly died in silence. The laughter stopped. Tanks that had roared across Europe became lifeless hulks, frozen solid in the fields. The lubricants inside their gearboxes crystallized. The mighty panzers, symbols of German power, were now iron coffins, their crews huddled inside for warmth. Machine guns jammed, rifles cracked from the cold. Soldiers wrapped themselves in curtains, tablecloths, and straw. Anything to survive nights that reached minus 40 degrees Celsius. The Soviets, however, were ready. They had faced winters like this for generations. Their equipment was simple, rugged, and built for the climate. Their soldiers wore felt boots and heavy coats, their vehicles filled with antifreeze that kept engines alive. When the Red Army counterattacked in December, it was as if the winter itself had turned against the Germans. Siberian troops, hardened veterans of the East, stormed through the snow with white camouflage and skis. The German generals, who had once laughed at the idea of a winter campaign, now watched in disbelief as their divisions were torn apart. At the front, desperation replaced discipline. Crews tried to light fires beneath their tanks to thaw the engines, sometimes setting them ablaze instead. Others stripped vehicles for parts just to power one machine out of 10. The once invincible Wehrmacht, designed for rapid conquest, was now trapped in a frozen graveyard. By Christmas, the snow had buried their dreams of victory. And as the winds howled across the steppe, even the most loyal officers began to whisper what none had dared to say before, that the winter was not just an obstacle, it was an enemy. By December 1941, the German army was no longer advancing. It was simply trying to survive. The same soldiers who had once marched proudly through Paris now dug shallow holes in the frozen earth, using helmets as shovels. Their summer uniforms, designed for the warmth of Western Europe, were useless against the merciless Russian cold. Frostbite blackened their fingers and toes. Men froze to death in their sleep, their bodies stiff by morning. The front lines had turned into a landscape of misery. The wind cut through torn coats like knives, and snow piled so deep that even movement became agony. Vehicles lay buried under white drifts, their engines split apart from the cold. Field kitchens, unable to heat water, served frozen rations that soldiers had to break with bayonets. "The cold is our greatest enemy," one lieutenant wrote in his diary. "It kills faster than the Russians." And still the fighting did not stop. The Soviets had launched their counteroffensive on December 5th, led by General Zhukov. Reinforced with Siberian divisions trained to fight in extreme cold, they struck with brutal precision. German lines buckled. The once feared Wehrmacht found itself retreating for the first time in the war. From Moscow, Stalin watched with grim satisfaction. The same winter that had crushed Napoleon's Grand Armée in 1812 was now doing the same to Hitler's legions. The German generals who had mocked history were now prisoners of it. Inside frozen trenches, men prayed not for victory, but for warmth. The oil in their weapons froze solid. Bolts refused to move, and triggers snapped under the pressure of the frost. Machine guns had to be urinated on just to keep them functioning. The cold made metal brittle, and when soldiers tried to touch their rifles with bare hands, their skin stuck to the steel and tore away. At night, the silence was eerie, broken only by the distant thunder of Soviet artillery. When shells hit the snow, the sound was muffled, like explosions underwater. The sky was an endless gray, the stars hidden behind the freezing clouds. Even the dead remained where they fell, their bodies frozen so hard that burial was impossible. German commanders sent desperate telegrams back to Berlin, begging for winter clothing and supplies. But the Reich's logistics system, stretched thin across 1,000 kilometers, could no longer keep up. Trains stalled, convoys froze, and vital shipments of food and fuel never arrived. At headquarters, officers tried to maintain discipline. They told the men to hold their positions, to wait for reinforcements, to trust the Führer's plan. But faith could not warm them. As temperatures plunged to minus 40 degrees Celsius, even hope began to die. The once mighty panzer divisions, symbols of mechanized power, were now nothing but monuments of failure. Engines shattered, turrets froze in place, entire units were stranded without movement, their tanks buried beneath snow like tombstones marking the death of a dream. The Soviets, meanwhile, adapted and attacked relentlessly. They used the weather as a weapon, moving swiftly on skis, encircling isolated German pockets, striking supply depots with ruthless efficiency. The Red Army soldiers were not only fighting for their homeland, they were fighting with it. By New Year's Eve, the Eastern Front was a frozen wasteland of shattered armor and human suffering. The Germans, once certain of victory, now realized the truth. They had not only underestimated the Soviet army, but the very land itself. In the biting cold, generals who had once laughed at winter now stared out over endless white plains and saw their armies dying before their eyes. And as the blizzards howled, one bitter thought echoed in every heart. The Russian winter did not just stop them, it was destroying them. By January 1942, the German army that had once seemed unstoppable was broken, frozen, and clinging to life. The dream of conquering Moscow had vanished beneath the snow. The grand offensive, the one Hitler had promised would end the war in a matter of months, had turned into a nightmare of unimaginable suffering. German soldiers, once the image of discipline and precision, now looked like ghosts. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their uniforms torn and filthy. The cold had stripped away the arrogance that had carried them through Europe. Frostbite had taken fingers, toes, and entire limbs. The smell of death lingered in the air, not of blood or smoke, but of bodies frozen stiff in the snow. Officers wrote reports filled with words they had never dared to use before: collapse, exhaustion, despair. Even the most loyal units could barely function. Some divisions had lost over half their strength, not to combat, but to exposure. The soldiers tried to improvise. They wrapped rags around their boots, burned furniture from captured villages to keep warm, and slaughtered their own horses for food. Helmets were replaced by fur hats stolen from civilians. Blankets were traded for bread. The Wehrmacht, once the most mechanized army in the world, had become medieval. Meanwhile, the Red Army was gaining momentum. Soviet morale, once on the brink of collapse, now soared. They knew the land, the cold, the way the snow could both hide and kill. They used it all to their advantage. At night, Soviet ski troops glided silently through the forests, their white uniforms blending perfectly into the landscape. They struck like ghosts, cutting communications, ambushing convoys, and vanishing into the snow before the Germans could respond. Entire German outposts disappeared overnight, their fires still burning, their men frozen where they stood. In Moscow, Stalin was relentless. Factories were operating around the clock, producing weapons, ammunition, and winter gear. Supplies were rushed to the front by any means necessary. While the Germans froze, the Soviets adapted. The same winter that had nearly killed them months earlier was now their greatest ally. Inside German headquarters, panic began to spread. The generals who had promised victory before winter now argued among themselves. Some begged Hitler to order a retreat to safer positions. Others feared even mentioning the word withdrawal. The Führer's response was brutal and absolute. Not one step back. The order sealed their fate. Thousands of men trapped in exposed positions were ordered to hold ground against an enemy who was not only stronger but better prepared. They had no shelter, no supplies, and no escape. They dug shallow foxholes into frozen soil so hard it shattered their shovels. And when the Soviet artillery began its bombardment, the snow itself turned deadly, exploding into icy shards that tore through flesh like glass. By mid-January, temperatures reached minus 45 degrees Celsius in some sectors. Fuel froze in barrels, blood froze in wounds. The cold was no longer weather, it was a weapon. A soldier from the 3rd Panzer Division wrote in his diary, "We thought we were fighting men. We are fighting the earth, the sky, the wind. We are fighting Russia itself." Those who survived the cold faced new horrors when the Soviets counterattacked. Their tanks, crude, heavy T-34s, moved where German panzers could not. Their engines, built for simplicity, roared through the snow while German machines sat dead and silent. And as Soviet infantry advanced behind them, the battlefield became a frozen graveyard. A landscape of steel and ice where the once proud German army was being slowly entombed. The winter had done what no army in Europe had ever achieved. It had broken the Wehrmacht's illusion of invincibility. And in the white stillness of the Russian plains, as the snow fell softly on frozen tanks and lifeless men, the echo of the German general's laughter was gone, buried forever beneath the frost. By February 1942, the German front in the east had ceased to resemble a military campaign. It was now a desperate struggle for survival. The endless snowdrifts stretched for miles, dotted only by the blackened shells of destroyed tanks and the frozen bodies of men who had once believed themselves unstoppable. The German generals, who months earlier had spoken with arrogance of a swift victory, now watched helplessly as their armies withered in the cold. Every message that reached headquarters told the same story. Men freezing in their trenches, engines that would not start, and supply convoys lost in the blizzards. No reinforcements, no fuel, no hope. Hitler refused to retreat. "The German soldier does not yield to the weather," he declared from the warmth of his headquarters in East Prussia. But the weather didn't care. The cold came for everyone. The panzers, once symbols of technological dominance, stood silent and lifeless. Their once sleek armor was coated in frost, their machine guns iced over. Mechanics tried everything, lighting fires under engines, draining fuel into barrels to keep it from freezing, even mixing alcohol with oil to thin it. Nothing worked. The tanks that had conquered Europe were now monuments of failure, frozen tombs scattered across the steppe. When the Soviets attacked, they didn't waste ammunition on them. They simply drove around the dead machines and targeted the men who still clung to life inside. German infantry tried to build shelter where they could, in burnt-out houses, barns, or holes dug into the frozen soil. Inside, they huddled together like animals, wrapping themselves in straw, rags, and whatever cloth they could find. The fires they lit filled the rooms with choking smoke, but without them, they would die before dawn. Letters from home arrived rarely, if at all. The few that did were smudged, soaked, and often unreadable from the moisture of hands too numb to hold them. In their final moments of strength, soldiers wrote their own letters, knowing they would never be sent. One corporal wrote, "We no longer fight the Russians. We fight hunger, frost, and despair. We live like shadows. When I sleep, I dream of warmth, and when I wake, I wish I hadn't." Disease began to spread. Frostbite led to infection. Infection led to death. The medics had no supplies, no morphine, and no shelter. The wounded froze before they could even cry out. And still, Hitler demanded results. Orders came for counterattacks that were impossible to carry out. Men were told to retake villages that no longer existed, buried under meters of snow. Commanders who hesitated were accused of cowardice. Meanwhile, the Soviets grew stronger. Their supply lines were short, their morale rising. New units poured into the front from the Urals, equipped with winter clothing, food, and tanks that could withstand the cold. The Red Army, once mocked as disorganized and inferior, now fought with brutal confidence. At Rev, Vyazma, and Kaluga, German forces were encircled and destroyed. Entire divisions vanished into the snow. Reports sent to Berlin were vague, stripped of emotion, severe losses, positions untenable, further reinforcements required. But behind those words was catastrophe. By late February, temperatures dropped again. The dead could no longer be buried. They froze where they fell. Rifles still clutched in their hands, faces locked in expressions of shock or peace. The snow covered them, one by one, until they disappeared entirely. For the German generals, there was no victory left to claim, no maneuver to salvage. The war they had promised would be over in months had become an endless graveyard, stretching from Smolensk to Moscow. And every night, as the wind howled across the steppe and the ice cracked beneath their boots, they remembered the laughter that had once filled their war rooms. It was a cruel irony now, that they had laughed at the Russian winter until it became their executioner. By March in 1942, the German army in the East was barely recognizable. The proud, disciplined machine that had marched across Europe now resembled a starving, frost-bitten horde. The men's faces were hollow, their eyes sunken, their uniforms in tatters. What had once been the mightiest army in the world was now fighting for scraps of food, warmth, and sanity. Spring was still months away, and the cold refused to release its grip. The temperature had risen slightly, but that only turned the snow into a deep, filthy slush that swallowed boots and wagons alike. What few supplies arrived from the west were often lost in the mud or intercepted by Soviet partisans. Every German position was the same. Desperate men huddled in holes or ruined villages, surrounded by frozen corpses and broken machines. Food was rationed to almost nothing. A single piece of bread was worth more than gold. Soldiers boiled leather belts and horse meat to stay alive. They melted snow for water, though it burned their throats with smoke and ash from the constant fires. Disease finished what the cold had started. Typhus, pneumonia, and dysentery swept through the ranks. Medical supplies were long gone. The wounded were often left to die, covered with whatever rags their comrades could spare. The Soviets pressed their advantage relentlessly. They attacked not only with weapons, but with time itself. Every passing day was another blow to the Germans, who could no longer move, no longer repair their machines, no longer fight as they once had. The Red Army soldiers, hardened by years of suffering, moved with purpose and fury. They knew the land, they knew the cold, and they knew that winter was their ally. Soviet tanks rolled where German panzers lay frozen. Soviet rifles fired while German weapons jammed. The Germans fought bravely, but courage could not overcome nature. Their tanks were still dead monuments in the snow, their engines long frozen. Men used them as shelters now, crawling inside the cold metal hulls at night, lighting small fires inside for warmth, breathing the same thin airs until they passed out. Inside one such frozen panzer, a soldier wrote on the metal wall with a piece of charcoal, "The tank is dead. The war is dead. Only winter remains." By mid-March, the German generals were finally forced to face the truth. Their invasion had failed. They had not broken the Soviet Union. They had not captured Moscow. The lightning war that had worked in the West had turned into a slow death in the East. Hitler refused to hear it. He ranted in his headquarters, calling his generals weak, accusing them of cowardice. He ordered them to hold every position, no matter the cost. He still believed that discipline and willpower could defeat the cold. But willpower could not start a frozen engine, and discipline could not thaw a dead man. Even the most loyal officers began to see the futility. Some tried to reason with Berlin, asking for permission to withdraw to defensible positions. Others simply disobeyed orders in silence, retreating at night to save what was left of their men. The few supply aircraft that reached the front dropped crates of food and ammunition from the sky. Many of them landed far from the lines where starving men fought over the parachutes like wolves. The once proud German army, the master of Europe, now looked like an army of beggars. And still, the winter dragged on. The snow fell again in late March, covering everything. The ruins, the corpses, the tanks, the memories. It was as if the land itself wanted to erase the invasion, to bury every trace of it beneath a white, merciless silence. One German war correspondent wrote home, "We did not come to fight men. We came to fight a land that devours us whole." And in the distance, beyond the frozen rivers and blackened forests, Soviet factories thundered on, feeding a war machine that was only growing stronger. The balance had shifted. The Germans could no longer win, only endure. By April 1942, the Eastern Front was a graveyard of machines and dreams. The snow was melting now, revealing the true scale of the disaster beneath it. Rusted tanks, broken artillery, and the corpses of thousands of men who had fallen where they froze. Fields that had once been white were now streaked with black and red. The thaw turned the land into a swamp of mud, oil, and decay. The German army, trapped between exhaustion and starvation, was in ruins. Supply columns that tried to reach the front were swallowed by endless miles of mud. Horses collapsed in their harnesses. Trucks sank up to their axles and were abandoned. The retreating soldiers, half dead from hunger and cold, moved like ghosts through a land that refused to forgive them. The thaw did not bring relief, only misery in a new form. Where the frost had killed swiftly, the mud killed slowly. Weapons jammed with filth, vehicles stalled, and men who fell in the muck sometimes never stood up again. The smell of rotting bodies filled the air as the earth began to release what winter had hidden. For the German generals, it was an unbearable humiliation. They had promised the Führer that Moscow would fall before winter. They had sworn that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of blitzkrieg. Now they were losing entire divisions, not to the enemy, but to nature itself. Yet Hitler would not hear the truth. He ordered more attacks, demanded fresh offensives. He refused to believe the reports coming from the front, calling them exaggerated, defeatist, even treasonous. "The Russian will break first," he insisted. "He always does." But the Russians were not breaking. They were preparing. The Soviets had endured their own horrors that winter, but they had survived. And now as the snow melted, their strength was returning. Supplies flowed from factories deep in the Ural Mountains. Trains brought weapons, ammunition, and reinforcements to the front. The Red Army, once scattered and demoralized, now stood firm. Their soldiers wore proper winter uniforms, their tanks rolled freely over the thawing earth, and their morale was unshakable. In contrast, German morale had collapsed. Letters home were filled with despair. "The snow was merciful," one soldier wrote. "Now we can smell death again." Many had stopped believing in victory altogether. They fought only to survive another day, another night in the mud, another meal, if they were lucky enough to find one. The German tanks, once the pride of the Reich, were now symbols of futility. Many sat half submerged in the melting fields, their crews gone, their steel bodies corroding in silence. The engineers who had built them for lightning war could never have imagined this, their creations becoming iron coffins in a land too vast to conquer. German officers tried to hold their men together with discipline, but even that began to crumble. Some units disintegrated entirely. Desertion, once unthinkable, became common. Soldiers abandoned their posts, wandering into the forests or surrendering to the Soviets just to escape the endless misery. The Red Army, relentless and methodical, began to push forward again. Not in great leaps, but in steady, grinding advances. Soviet artillery pounded the German lines day and night, churning the wet ground into rivers of mud and blood. For every German tank destroyed, 2 Soviet ones appeared. For every soldier who fell, another took his place. As April dragged on, the front stabilized. But it was a fragile, temporary calm. Both sides were exhausted, but the Germans knew the truth. They were trapped in a war they could no longer win. The endless plains, the merciless weather, and the sheer will of the Soviet people had turned their triumph into torment. The German generals no longer laughed at winter. They barely spoke at all. In the dim light of their dugouts, they studied their maps, staring at lines that no longer meant anything. The red arrows pressing westward were not just enemy movements. They were history itself, moving against them. And as the wind howled across the thawing steppes, one thought haunted them all. They had come to conquer the East, but the East had conquered them. By May 1942, The illusion of German control in the east had completely collapsed. The generals who had once boasted of reaching the Urals now spoke only in whispers of survival. Entire armies were broken, scattered, or starving in the endless Russian wilderness. The snow was gone, but in its place came something even worse. The thawing ground revealed the full horror of what winter had buried. Everywhere the thaw exposed the cost of arrogance. Dead horses, half-buried tanks, and soldiers still sitting at their guns, frozen where they had fallen months before. The once white landscape was now a sea of blackened mud, charred wood, and twisted steel. Crows circled overhead, feeding on what remained. The stench of decay was inescapable. In Berlin, propaganda spoke of strategic withdrawals, of regrouping for the summer offensive. But the men at the front knew better. There was no strategy left, only desperation. German divisions that had once numbered 15,000 men now had fewer than 4,000. Some units had lost nearly all their vehicles. Ammunition was scarce, food scarcer still. And yet the orders from high command kept coming. Hold your ground. The generals knew it was madness. The spring thaw had turned the battlefield into a swamp. The tanks couldn't move, the trucks couldn't drive, and the supply lines had dissolved into rivers of mud. Soldiers carried supplies on their backs through waist-deep muck, sinking with every step. A journey of a few kilometers could take an entire day, but the Soviets kept moving. They had learned from their early defeats. Their logistics, once chaotic, were now organized. Their factories, far beyond German bombers' reach, were producing tanks, guns, and ammunition faster than the Germans could destroy them. And above all, they had found their rhythm, a grim, unstoppable momentum. At dawn, the Soviet artillery would thunder. Then came the infantry, advancing through the smoke and mud, firing from the hip, shouting their battle cries. The Germans, weakened and hungry, fought fiercely but without hope. Machine guns rattled, mortars fell, but the waves kept coming. When the fighting stopped, the fields were carpeted with the dead, German gray mixed with Soviet brown. But for every fallen Russian, two more appeared. For every German tank destroyed, the Soviets rolled out another T-34 from the factories in the Urals. In command posts, the German generals could no longer ignore what was happening. They had not lost a battle. They had lost a war of endurance. Letters and diaries from this period tell the same story, disbelief turning to despair. One officer wrote, "The cold took our bodies, the mud took our machines, and now Russia is taking our souls." Even the mighty Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could do little. Airfields were unusable. Their runways turned to lakes of mud. Engines refused to start, munitions were soaked, and pilots sat in their cockpits, staring at the rain that fell endlessly from the gray sky. As May turned to June, a strange stillness descended across the front. The men were too exhausted to fight, too starved to move. Many barely spoke. They just stared out at the horizon, an endless, empty plain where nothing seemed alive except the wind. At night, they could hear the Soviets moving, trains in the distance, engines rumbling, voices calling in the dark. The Red Army was preparing for the next phase, and everyone knew it. For the Germans, the realization was devastating. The great blitzkrieg that had once swept across Europe had died in the snows of Russia. The Wehrmacht was no longer a hammer striking an anvil. It was a shell of its former self, battered by a land it could never conquer. The laughter that had echoed through their headquarters the previous summer, the jokes about a short campaign and one good push to Moscow, now seemed obscene. Because winter had done what no army could. It had crushed their machines, frozen their ambition, and shattered their pride. And now, as the thaw gave way to spring, the Germans finally understood what they had truly invaded. It was not just a country, it was a force of nature. By June 1942, the Eastern Front had transformed into a landscape of ruin. The once mighty Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe in under 2 years, now limped through the endless expanse of Russia, a ghost of its former self. The frozen plains had thawed into vast marshes, but the suffering remained. The soldiers who survived the winter were scarred, physically and mentally, by what they had endured. The thaw had brought new life to the land, but for the Germans, it only revealed death. Meltwater filled the craters left by artillery shells, turning them into shallow lakes where helmets, rifles, and human remains floated together. Villages that had been abandoned during the winter were now nothing more than blackened skeletons. Their roofs collapsed, their chimneys leaning at broken angles. For the first time since the war began, the Wehrmacht was no longer an army of conquest. It was an army of retreat. In the south, the German High Command began planning a new offensive, codenamed Case Blue. Hitler refused to accept defeat. If Moscow could not be taken, then the oil fields of the Caucasus would become the new prize. He spoke of fresh offensives and decisive victories, but his words carried no conviction among the men who had seen the Eastern Winter. They knew the truth. The front was broken, the army exhausted, and the enemy stronger than ever. The generals could not forget the winter's toll. Entire divisions had vanished, consumed not by Soviet fire, but by cold and hunger. Men had frozen in their trenches, their rifles still clutched in their hands. Tanks lay half buried in the snow, their tracks fused to the ground, their crews still sitting inside like statues of ice. Even now in the warmer months, the remnants of that catastrophe haunted the soldiers. When they dug new positions, they often unearthed the frozen dead from the months before. Some recognized the insignia of comrades lost during the December retreat. Others found entire machine gun nests buried intact beneath the thawed earth, as if time itself had preserved their failure. But if winter had broken the Germans, it had hardened the Soviets. The Red Army, once disorganized and reeling, had emerged from the cold stronger and more determined than ever. They had survived the worst that nature and the enemy could inflict, and now they were ready to strike back. New divisions arrived daily from the east, equipped with fresh weapons, better tanks, and new uniforms. Soviet factories, relocated deep within the Urals, poured out supplies in numbers that stunned German intelligence. What the Germans had dismissed as chaos now revealed itself as sheer resilience, an industrial and human willpower that would not die. On the front lines, the Germans could feel the change. Soviet patrols were bolder, attacks more coordinated. The once defensive Red Army was beginning to move forward again. The ground that had cost the Germans so many lives to take during the summer of 1941 was now being lost inch by inch. The weather mocked them. Days of blazing sun baked the mud until it cracked, only for sudden rains to return and drown it again. The soldiers' boots rotted from constant wetness. Their uniforms, worn since the previous summer, were stiff with sweat and filth. Fleas and lice spread diseases that no medicine could cure. The men no longer spoke of victory, they spoke of survival. For many of them, the memories of winter had become ghosts that followed them everywhere. They remembered the way the cold had silenced everything, how men had frozen mid-step, their faces locked in expressions of terror or disbelief. They remembered the sound of tanks dying one by one in the frost, the stillness that followed, the knowledge that they had come to Russia as conquerors and become prisoners of its land and sky. And they knew it would come again. Even as the sun rose higher, even as the grass began to grow, the veterans of the front could feel it. The cold waiting beyond the horizon. They whispered of it at night, when the fires burned low. "It will return," they said. "The snow always comes back." They were right, because the war in Russia was no longer a campaign. It was a cycle of advance and retreat, of heat and ice, of arrogance and punishment. And though the generals still plotted their next move, every man who had survived the winter knew one truth that could not be erased. The next cold season would come, and with it, the reckoning. By July 1942, the once invincible Wehrmacht had become a weary, bleeding force stretched thin across 1,000 miles of hostile land. Yet Hitler demanded more. He spoke of destiny, of pushing south toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. The generals, still haunted by the horror of the winter, obeyed, though many knew they were marching toward ruin. The Eastern Front was vast beyond comprehension. The German lines stretched across plains, forests, and mountains. Too long to defend, too fragile to hold. The men who had survived the winter carried those scars with them. They had seen engines freeze, comrades die of cold, and entire divisions vanish into snow. Now they faced something equally merciless: heat, dust, and exhaustion. The same machines that had once frozen solid now choked in the summer air. Engines overheated. Oil boiled. The tracks of tanks threw up black dust that settled in every pore, every breath. Soldiers coughed blood, their uniforms stiff with grime. The frozen wasteland had become an inferno, and in both, death waited patiently. But the memory of winter still lingered. It had changed the way they saw the land. Not as territory to conquer, but as a vast, living enemy. They feared the signs of its return. Even in the heat of July, when the steppes shimmered with sunlight, men glanced toward the north, toward the forest where snow would soon fall again. The Red Army was no longer the same desperate force that had stumbled in 1941. Soviet pilots now ruled sections of the sky. T-34s rolled across the plains in organized waves, their engines unbothered by dust or heat. Soviet commanders had learned from every mistake, adapting with terrifying speed. The Germans, by contrast, were running on borrowed time. Ammunition was scarce, food supplies unreliable. What reinforcements they received were young and untested, boys who had never seen battle. The veterans looked at them with pity, knowing they would not last long. At Stalingrad, the first signs of the coming disaster appeared. The Germans pushed forward, confident they could take the city quickly, just as they had done in dozens before. But the Soviets dug in deep. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress. The Germans had no idea that this fight would be their undoing, that the ghosts of the last winter were about to rise again. The Soviet counterattacks began in the late summer. At first, they were small, probing, testing, bleeding the Germans a little more each day. But behind them lay something immense, something the Germans could feel but not see. As the weeks dragged on, the German soldiers began to speak of omens. Strange winds that came suddenly at night, chilling them to the bone. The early frost that coated their weapons before dawn. The returning silence. The same silence that had come before the first great freeze of 1941. They were right to be afraid. By September, the temperatures began to drop again. The summer heat vanished as quickly as it had come. Rain turned the ground into endless mud once more. German vehicles sank where they stood. Supply trucks broke down. The same nightmare was beginning again. And this time, there would be no illusion of victory to sustain them. The veterans recognized every stage of it. The fog in the mornings, the ice that crept along the rivers, the stiffening of their hands as they gripped their rifles. Winter was returning, step by step, mile by mile, and with it came the Red Army, better armed, better supplied, and burning with vengeance. The Germans tried to convince themselves they could endure it again, that they had learned from the last time. But deep down they knew the truth. The first winter had broken their strength. The second would destroy them completely. They had once laughed at the Russian cold. Now they prayed to survive it. And as the wind began to howl once more across the endless steppe, carrying with it the first flakes of snow, the men who remained whispered the same words to one another in terror and disbelief. Not again! Please, not again! By November 1942, the wind had returned, that same bitter, cutting wind that the Germans had once dismissed as a myth. Snow began to fall over the endless plains of Russia once more, blanketing the wreckage of war in cold white silence. To the west of the Volga River, the city of Stalingrad burned, its ruins glowing like embers in the dark. The German army, already stretched to its breaking point, now found itself trapped, encircled, freezing, and running out of everything. They had come to Russia believing themselves masters of war. Now they were prisoners of winter once again. The same mistakes were repeated, the same arrogance, the same disbelief that the elements could be stronger than steel. Their tanks, their trucks, their guns, all the weapons that had carried them across Europe, froze solid once more. Fuel turned to jelly. Engines cracked open. Men lit fires beneath their vehicles, trying desperately to thaw the machinery, just as they had done a year earlier. It was all for nothing. Inside Stalingrad, the cold was indescribable. Buildings offered little protection. The walls were riddled with holes, the roofs long gone. The wind cut through the ruins, turning breath into frost in the air. The soldiers, gaunt and hollow-eyed, huddled together in cellars, wrapping themselves in newspapers and curtains scavenged from the rubble. Some carried the same threadbare coats they had worn the previous winter, the same coats that had already failed them once. Their rations had long since run out. Bread was replaced by soup made from wallpaper paste and sawdust. Horses were eaten, then dogs, then, in the most desperate corners, worse, the once proud Wehrmacht was starving, freezing, and dying in a city that had become its tomb. Outside the city, the Soviets struck back with a vengeance. Operation Uranus, the counterattack, encircled the entire German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 men were trapped. The same generals who had once laughed at the thought of winter now begged for airlifts, for supplies, for escape. None would come. The skies above the Volga filled with snow and smoke. German planes tried to reach the trapped army, dropping crates that often fell into Soviet hands instead. What little reached the soldiers was barely enough to survive another day. The Red Army, better equipped, better prepared, and fueled by the memory of their own suffering, closed in. And still the cold deepened. By December, temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite became universal. Men lost fingers, ears, entire limbs. Weapons shattered when fired. Boots froze to the ground. The same sounds echoed as they had the year before. The crack of ice underfoot, the distant thunder of Soviet artillery, and the quiet, hopeless murmurs of men who knew they would never go home. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, those who could still fight did so with empty eyes. They no longer fought for Germany, or for victory, or even for survival. They fought simply because there was nothing else left to do. When the Soviets finally broke through in February 1943, the once mighty German army surrendered. What remained of the Sixth Army, over 90,000 frostbitten, starving men, marched into captivity through the same snow they had once mocked. Fewer than 5,000 would ever return home. In Berlin, news of the disaster spread slowly, muffled by censorship and denial. But among the generals who still remembered the laughter of 1941, there was silence. They understood what had truly destroyed them. Not just the Red Army, not just their own hubris, but the land itself. The unrelenting, unforgiving Russian winter. The tanks that had once symbolized Germany's power lay buried under snow. The engines that had roared across Europe were now silent. The soldiers who had believed themselves conquerors were now frozen statues scattered across the steppe, grim monuments to arrogance and defeat. The Russian winter had claimed them all, and as the snow fell endlessly over the ruins of Stalingrad, one truth became eternal. No army, no matter how powerful, could ever laugh at winter again. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.